The free Imperial City had 6 bells, and in the year of our Lord 1385, they struck the hour of raids. Nuremberg, the rat proclaimed, was a city of order, a ring of stone walls hung with ivy and iron, soot drifting from workshops into the morning fog, gutters glistening with tannery rinses, hammer songs from the foundries echoing off wet timber. At dawn the watchmen took their sour beer, the butchers dragged ruminant refuse toward the river, and the apprentices swept doorsteps with brooms that left stripes in the dust. Yet order, the councillors whispered beneath candlelight, did not depend only on locks and laws. It depended on cloth, on who had the right to glean, and who must stay dull for the city to keep its shape. In that year the Sumptuary ordinance was copied by the scribe with cramped fingers and a knife to trim the vellum. No craftsman's wife to wear fur above the knee, no sleeves slit to show a second lining unless you were patrician by birth, no silk hoods for journeymen, no silver buttons upon common coats. The names of furs were spelled out like crimes: ermine for councillors, vair for master merchants, sable for no one outside a half-dozen households whose ancestors' bones lay under crossed slabs in St. Sebald. Cloth spoke rank, and the rat would teach tongues to dress in their own place. That morning a new decree was nailed beside the market toll: garments could be seized in the street. A tailor who cut forbidden trimmings would have his shears smashed and his name written in the black book. A wife who wore fur beyond her husband's station must lose the fur at once, sliced from the hem under the open eye of her neighbors. Fines would follow, of course. Fines always followed, like stray dogs following a slaughter wagon. The first to hear the bell were the stadknecht, city servants in half-gray, half-black, with the rat's keys jangling from their belts. They moved down the stone steps of the Rathaus with a clerk, a tally stick, and a rolled copy of the ordinance tied with a crimson ribbon, the only bright thing in the lane. They smelt of wool that had known rain, and of oil for their iron hooks. The clerk's nose twitched with ink and old vellum. The watchman's boots made small hard sounds on the cobbles, like a tailor's hammer tapping a last. The tailor called Matthias, once merely Matthias of the narrow lane, now master in the guild by dint of 25 winters, heard those sounds while his apprentice heaved pails. His shop was a rectangle of lamplight over the street, lint spattered with chalk, the air full of dust motes and carded wool and the low sweetness of dye that never quite washed from his hands. A swath of vair, gray squirrel, costly as a whisper, lay folded on the table like a sin. He had not bought it. His longest client had insisted, Herr Kraft, dealer in spices, who paid on time and often, whose wife had wrists pale as milk and eyes that watched how other women watched her. He wanted ermoni, said Herr Kraft, but would accept vair, for the ordinance was sharp, and the rat watched sleeves more keenly than throats. Matthias had cut the trim the way one cuts bread when one has children, carefully measuring with the mind as much as with the stick. The apprentices had blown on their fingers in the cold and wept when the lamp smoke stung. He told himself he would keep his shears low, keep his seams narrow, keep his conscience wrapped. But the ordinance had a new blade, and it cut farther than he knew. The stadknechte reached the Tuchhaus, the cloth hall, where bolts lay like painted hills and merchants counted in murmurs. Here the clerk unfurled the decree. It hung from his hand like a second skin. By order of the council he read, and the words skittered over the flags like rats over barley. No man of lesser estate shall dress his wife or daughters in fur beyond a half-hand's breadth at the collar, nor in silk that gleams as the sun at noon. No tailor shall cut such trimmings for them on pain of seizure and fine. These limits are for the preservation of order, the fear of God, and the dignity of this city. Dignity, the merchants thought as their eyes dropped. Dignity with a price on it. By the fountain where women filled buckets and rubbed laundry against rinsed boards, a wool worker's wife had stitched squirrel at her cuffs, neat and narrow. She had never touched sable. She had never touched ermine, save perhaps a scrap kept in a chest for dowry. She had a child on her hip who gnawed at her sleeve with a wet mouth, and she carried herself to forget the weight at her belly and the ache between shoulder blades that came from years at the card, teasing snaggled wool into order. She saw the watchmen when everyone saw them, because they made themselves seen. They had that look of men who could take without asking and call the taking lawful. "Good wife," said the clerk, wherein the word good had a weight like a pebble. "Your cuffs contravene." She looked down as if her arms had betrayed her. "It is narrow," she said. "The ordinance is narrow also," the clerk replied. "Hold still." The crowd formed the way crowds form in cities, by habit and hunger. Those who liked to see law at work drifted in from the sides. An old man with a lice comb in his hatband craned forward. A baker, flour dusting his eyebrows like snow, stared as if he were watching bread judged. The clerk nodded to the stadtknecht, who drew a knife not meant for harm but for honesty, and slid it under her cuff. He lifted, and the tiny stitches popped like mice bones. Fur came away from cloth with a dry whisper. The child startled and began to cry, a thin sound over the splash of water in the fountain. "Shall we cut to the elbow?" the clerk asked, a formality. "The law speaks to the arm entire." She shook her head. "Please," she said, and she did not say "for the love of God," because the tithe chest already heard so many prayers. The stadtknecht cut to the cuff only, and the fur shivered in his hand. He dropped it into a sack where other narrow sins rested. He wrote a mark on his tally, and the crowd saw the crimson ribbon on the decree wink, as if pleased. A fine would follow, paid across a table of oak to a scribe who did not look her in the eye. Or perhaps she would slip the fine and lose standing in the parish, her name scratched on a board for those who do not pay their lawful dues. You would have paid, would you not, if it were your name on a board, your child's godfather glancing away in the lane? Or would you have risked the stocks and their quiet cold, the blackbirds hopping near your feet, the shame as constant as the bell? By mid-morning the stadtknecht moved through the weaver's quarter, checking sleeves, eyeing hoods. They were not cruel men by nature, most of them. They simply smelled the council's breath on the back of their necks. They touched clothing the way money lenders touch coins, quickly, with fingers that know surfaces. Twice they seized silk linings that flashed when women turned their wrists. Once, like a blessing, they let a seam pass, its ribbon dull as dust. Matthias watched from his doorway as they came up his lane. He saw the iron shears in their minds before he saw the iron hooks at their belts. He told his apprentice to put away the ware and bring out worsted for a saddler whose coins were already counted. But the apprentice was young and slow, and his fingers fumbled, and he bumped the table, and the folded trim slid to the edge like a lover to the lip of a bed. "Master," the boy whispered. "The street." The stadtknecht's glove lay on the wood like a brand. He lifted the trim, squeezed it, rubbed it between forefinger and thumb. "There," he said without venom. "For whom?" "For a man of standing," Matthias said. His voice felt like a thread pulled too tight. The clerk, who knew words better than cloth, let his eyes run along a line cut on the bench. The tailor's shears, long and heavy, lay by his hand. The apprentice could not look at them, for in his head they had already snapped. "You know the ordinance," the clerk said. "I know how cold winters are," Matthias replied. "Cold does not alter station," the clerk said. And he was not unkind. He was simply the instrument of a tune that had been written before he was born. They made him stand in his own doorway. They made him bring out the garment he had started, the gown for Herr Kraft's wife, still sleeveless, still pinned. The clerk read from his ribbon scroll for the neighbors who had not yet heard. "Fur forbidden to tradesmen," he recited. "Tailors' shears to be broken where they have violated this law." Matthias could have begged. He could have named Herr Kraft, dragged the spice dealer's good name into the lane like a carcass dragged to the block. He could have said that the woman who would wear it only for a feast, only for the coldest hours of the vigil, that no one would see but those who already wore more. He said none of these things. He thought of his wife, who kept their chest key on a cord under her kirtle, and of the boys who burned their fingers on the brazier, and of how long a man's name lingers in the mouths of others when it has been said in the wrong place. The stadtknecht took his shears, and in the air above the bench they came together like jaws and struck a spark. Whether the spark was real or only the flash of Matthias's blood behind his eyes, he could not tell. The iron across iron sank. The blades did not break. Such shears are strong. But the stadtknecht knew where to strike. He brought a hammer, and he brought it down where the rivet held, and the mouth of the shears gaped open uselessly, a fish torn from the line. The neighbors watched in a hush that tasted of smoke and resentment. A woman made a little sound in her throat. The apprentice bit his lip until it marked white, then purple. The clerk noted it all. One pair of shears destroyed, one tailor's name, Matthias of the narrow lane. Fine to be determined. Cloth seized, there, length enough for 2 hems. Matthias felt his own hands as if they belonged to someone else. He felt the smoothness at his thumb where the shears had worn a groove over years, a small clean valley. He felt the cold air slide along his wrists as if searching for his pulse. A rat ran along the beam overhead, knock-knocking like a tiny hammer. After, the stadtknecht moved on. The lane filled with its former sound, the mutter of women, the clack of a cart, the squeal of a child who had grabbed a splinter. But the sound had changed. It had become higher, sharper, a half-step of tension in a song that usually flowed from morning to noon to night. People spoke in fragments for a while. Did you see? He never. It's always. They say next. Words trailed off because what they might say was dangerous. Herr Kraft came in the afternoon, blue cloak heavy, breath sweet with cinnamon and the clove casks he tended. He did not lower his hood until he was across the threshold. He saw the broken shears at once, that mouth gaping and his mouth hardened in sympathy that had no teeth. "We'll go to the rat," he said, and Matthias thought, "We will go nowhere. You will go to a cousin on the outer council and drink warm wine. I will stand in a corridor and smell the wax and listen to petitions fall like leaves." He did not say it. Herr Kraft lowered his voice. "I asked only for a little fur," he said. "For Feast of Candlemas. Everyone wears a little." Matthias nodded. "They do." "Then what is order?" Herr Kraft asked the heir. Order in that city was a ladder, and the rungs were woven of law. It was a bell schedule, and a list of names and a book black, not with paint, but with the grease of fingers who turned its pages. It was a council chamber that smelled of tallow and dust, and the slight sweetness of vellum scraped thin. It was a parish ledger, and a guild oath, and the whispers at the market, that stuck to a woman's shoulders like burrs. It was the right to cut a cloth, and the right to wear it, the right to show a glimmer or keep to gray. In the evenings that week, you could hear shears in other lanes smashed against stone, because sometimes the stadtknecht could not wait for the hammer at the hall. It pleased some to make the sound where it had meaning. At the threshold, on the block where bread is cut, on the bench where chalk still marked last month's measurements. A joiner leaned against his doorframe and watched a gown's velvet strip come away like skin. A goldsmith's wife turned her ring so the stone faced inward as if to hide, though no ordnance had yet tread there. A dyer spat blue into the gutter where it swirled like a little sky, then dissolved into the brown of the day. There were protests, but of a kind a city calls polite, guildmasters sending a delegation to the council, hats in hand, priests murmuring that charity must temper justice, wives weeping at the right moments, boys in the alehouse making wide gestures and making promises about the future. A journeyman tailor, too proud, too thin from November's work, cut a strip of rabbit and stitched it to his own cuff for spite. He made certain the stadknechte saw it. They seized him and made him stand by the pillory while a clerk read the ordinance aloud 3 times to a crowd that had begun with 5 and ended with 50. They did not beat him. They did not need to. The words beat. They ran their straps through the holes of his pride and drew until the buckle clicked. In church, the incense crawled up the columns like a memory. The tithe chest's iron ring was cold to the fingernail. A sermon turned to humility, and humility wore a dress of undyed wool with no fur at all. A relic, 2 splinters in a silver packet, paraded the nave, and eyes followed it the way eyes follow hunger, respectfully, warily. Men knelt and thought of their wives' cuffs. Women knelt and thought of their daughters' sleeves. When the choir sang, it was not the words but the rhythm that soothed, a pattern to push your breath into, to keep your mind from catching on the hooks of the weak. Matthias did not go to the stocks. He paid his fine, with money pulled from the jar that should have bought winter oil. He sent his eldest to fetch new shears from a cousin in Bamberg who owed him a favor. The boy returned 3 days later with a wrapped bundle, face chapped by wind off the river, and a note advising, kindly, to cut only what the law allowed. The new shears bit cleanly. The first cloth they cut was coarse and compliant, a poor man's cloak. On the 4th day after the ordinance, a woman came at dusk with her hood low and her hands tight around a package. She smelled of wood smoke and onions and the faint sour of old milk. She said her husband was a tinsmith, and she needed the old fur on her winter gown, let down to the knee for warmth. She set the package on his bench, and her eyes on the floor. In the package was a scrap of rabbit, worn thin at the edge. To lengthen it clean, he would have to cut at an angle and stitch under. It would take time. Time was money. Money was too short. "Do it," he said to his apprentice. "Do it now, and do it narrow." The apprentice held the needle like he held fear. He went for his rule to measure the breadth, and his hand shook, and a drop of oil fell on the cloth from the lamp and made a soft dark eye in the wool. The woman sucked her teeth, then made the sign of the cross over herself and the mark. "Leave it," she said. "God will not see it." God, Matthias thought, or the clerk. At the end of that week, the rat posted a list of those who had paid their fines, as if virtue could be written as neatly as debt. The parchment shone by candlelight, and men stood and frowned at it the way you frown at an itch you cannot scratch. Names spelled wrong pulled at the thread of identity. Names spelled right tightened it. Beside the list hung a new warning: heavier penalties for repeat violation. The counselors had discovered pleasure in punctuation. They had begun to write their sentences with knives. Word grew, rumor first, then confirmation, that the city would hold an inspection at the Guildhall after Sunday Mass. An examination of apparel, the clerk's note said, to ensure compliance and make an example of those who persist. Compliance, example, 2 hounds with the same chain. The guilds were to present their masters and their wives for viewing. Men joked about a marketplace of sleeves. Women sewed at night under blankets, trying to change what had already been seen and remembered by neighbors. On Sunday the sky was the color of wetted ash. The bells tolled in their familiar order, great, lesser, middle, little, little, and people moved like a winter river toward St. Lawrence, shoulders hunched against a wind that smelled of pig fat and damp stone. Inside the church, the air was heavy with breath, old wood, the faint sweetness of wax. Votives guttered in small saucers of brass that had been polished so often they showed the flesh-colored waves of hands in their surface. The priest spoke of the rich man and Lazarus and did not look at anyone's cuffs. When the peace passed, Awkward muttered hands touching hands. Matthias touched the knuckles of Herr Kraft, and each man felt the Uder's cold and thought it the Uder's fault. After mass the guild banners lifted in the courtyard, cloth stiff with emblems, shears and combs for the tailors, mallet and chisel for the masons, a key for the locksmiths, a boat for the rivermen. The banners had fringe. No one could agree whether fringe counted. The councillors mounted the steps. They were wrapped in lawful fur. Their hems brushed the stone like small waves in a cistern. With them came the clerk, his lips red from cold and rhetoric. Beside him strode a pair of stadknecht with a chest between them, a box for the confiscated fitted with iron corners, and the city seal impressed upon wax at the latch. The seal was a crowned eagle that had eaten too many rabbits. The inspection began. They called names. A master stepped forward with his wife. The wife stretched her arm and turned in a slow circle like a candlestick. The clerk peered as if into a prayer book. Men who had never looked closely at a sleeve suddenly felt that an inch was an ethical crisis. Some wives were sent home with nothing more than a warning that warmed no one. Some were made to stand while their cuffs were trimmed, the fur falling to lie like small gray tongues on the steps. Once, only once, did a woman slap at the stadknecht's hand when he reached for her hem. The slap sounded loud in the cold air. The crowd made a sound then that was not laughter, not sympathy, not anger exactly, just the jagged intake of 100 breaths. The stadknecht froze, then picked up his knife and cut as if his hand were made of rope. The woman did not move. Later in bed, someone would kiss that hand as if it had been burned. When it was Matthias's turn, he did not bring his wife forward, because her gown was safe and poor and moth-patched. He went alone, as master of the tailors. The councillors looked at him as if looking at the season, something not to be negotiated. The clerk spoke the paragraph about cutting. He spoke it well. He asked whether the guild would affirm to enforce the ordinance among their own. Matthias said the words the guild had agreed upon. "We will uphold good order." The phrase tasted of wood smoke and bitterness. He felt the eyes of every man behind him press like thumbs into his back. He heard a child cough in the crowd, a thin, dry cough that promised a long winter, and he thought of rabbit fur and how it holds a little heat. They made him witness the shears again, another tailor's this time, snapped where a rivet held, the iron mouth flopping, the son beside the father paling under a cap that had once been blue and now was the color of a faded bruise. Matthias felt an odd, unsteady mercy. He did not put a hand on the boy's shoulder. He did not speak to him. He simply looked, long enough that the boy would remember a face not entirely composed of law. When the chest was full enough to require 2 men to lift it with a grunt, the councillors called a halt as if calling for a final hymn. The clerk tied his crimson ribbon tight. The stadknecht nodded to one another as men nod after carrying a bier from Nav to street. The crowd broke apart by degrees. The bells began their laments for the hour. Somewhere in the next lane, a drummer boy practiced a rhythm for a feast he could not attend. At a stall near the square, a woman sold cloth that had already lost its color in the rain. She had 2 bolts only, both were rough, both were lawful. She folded them with hands nicked by needles. She muttered to herself, not curses, not prayers, just a list of things to remember. Ride a by on Tuesday, the pig to be seen to, a cousin's mother's funeral, a debt. The list was like a rosary with the names of the poor. How long, you wonder, could such a city keep its dignity tied to its sleeves? How long can law sit on a shoulder before the shoulder stoops? How much hunger would you endure for a king's peace, or a council's, if your children were warm for a day because you cut a cuff a little wider than the law allowed? Night fell. Lamps were lit in alleys that stank of fish and dung. Above the city, At a window whose leaded glass had been repaired twice since Michaelmas, a counselor read by candlelight the letters sent from other cities: Augsburg tightening wedding feast rules, Strasbourg forbidding shoe rosettes to master smiths, Ulm considering a ban on velvet hoods in church for all save those whose names crack like nuts in the mouth. The counselor thought, "It is good. It is necessary." He did not think of the child who had cried at the fountain. He had been a child once, but that was in a hall where fur was a season and not a sin. Below, at a bench that smelled of oil and fresh-cut worsted, Matthias cleaned his new shears with woolen breath and a scrap of soft leather. He tested them on a remnant that frayed at the edges and curled like a leaf in heat. The bite was true. In the rafters, the rat ran his smaller root. On the wall, the shadows of his hands made a crown and a comb and a pair of iron jaws, then dissolved as the lamp guttered. He thought of the guild oath. He thought of the black book. He thought of the woman with the rabbit trim and the drop of oil making an eye over her heart. He felt tired in the bones the way men feel tired when the rules of the world grow a half-hand stricter. A knock came at the door after complying, when decent people are abed and indecent ones are drinking. It was neither drink nor indecency. It was a boy from the council petty office, hair in his eyes, breath white. He held a scrap of vellum, as if it were a piece of bread for which there was a hunger. Matthias wiped his hands on his apron and took it. The seal was the same, the city's devouring bird. The note was brief: tomorrow, inspection of guild inventories. Bolts, linings, trimmings estriad. Penalties for concealment. There was no signature, because signatures are for equal men. He folded the note small and put it under a weight on the bench. He thought of the small attic over the bedroom, where, behind a beam, a strip of squirrel lay rolled and tied with a string like a memory. He thought of fire. He thought of hunger. He blew out the lamp and lay beside his wife in the straw-stuffed bed, the creak of the frame as familiar as a prayer. Outside, snow began to fall. Not much, not yet. A sugar on the roof slate. In the dark, cloth still spoke to him. It whispered not of warmth or modesty, but of rank, the way a coin whispers not of bread, but of debt. He closed his eyes and saw a chest with iron corners and a ribbon like a tongue. He saw his shears, open and shut, a heartbeat made of iron. In the morning the bells would call the guilds again, and the city would stand with its sleeves straight and its eyes lowered. The Stadtknechte would lift lids and count, and the crimson ribbon would be untied and retied, until obedience became the same kind of habit as hunger. And under that habit, in the narrow warm places of the city, the spaces under stairs, under beds, under breath, men and women would decide what could be hidden, what could be borne, what could be cut, and what must be stitched back by moonlight with thread so fine it could fool even the council's eye. Snow powdered the thresholds like flour when the guilds gathered again. The hall smelled of damp cloaks, smoke wedged in wool, cold ink. A brazier burned low as if to conserve dignity. The Stadtknechte lifted lids and tilted chests, hands moving with the unhurried confidence of men who had the bell on their side. Bolts thudded onto trestles, linings were unrolled, a slow unfurling of rank. The crimson ribbon lay on the clerk's board, stained now with soot and thumb grease, a tongue that had learned the taste of names. Matthias stood with the masters beneath the tailor's banner. He had hidden nothing, and he had hidden something. Both were true. The attic beam kept a scrap of squirrel like a relic keeps a sliver of bone, tied close, whispered over, touched in a dark no law could quite reach. On the trestle he laid down what he would not defend with his livelihood. Rabbit for cap linings, piece ends of fox he could swear had come from the cloak of a widow to be made into gloves, a strip of sheep with the curls scuffed out of it. The clerk's eyes slid. the way a priest's eyes sometimes slide past a poor man's empty hand and settle on the man's bowed head instead. He wrote numbers. He wrote one name carefully. Other guilds fared worse. The furriers had their small pride strung and counted, their excuses shaved down like pelts in a frost. The cloth merchants chewed their lips, while a bolt that gleamed a shade too like noon was fingered and pronounced suspect. The cooper's wife, who had padded her collar with a lining cut from a dead ant's gown, cried openly and would not stop, and in the end the clerk waved her away because grief is a poor thing to inventory. Herr Kraft came with his cap in hand, and left with it in both hands, knuckles white, because he had been fined in absence through the tailor, and a man rich in spice feels a fine like a pepper in the throat. It burns hotter because it is unexpected. He would not stop ordering. Men like him mend a front with purchase. But he would place his orders within the lines and let hunger do its whispering somewhere else. One discovery pricked the morning. In the chest of a competitor, Friedlein, who laughed too loudly and cut too liberally, a rolled lining of vair hung inside a bolt of plain frieze, like a small winter hidden in a drab day. The Stadneck's knife found it by sound, a different whisper beneath the cloth. The room drew in its breath, needles pricked palms. Friedlein blustered, swore oaths in the names of saints, whose bones rattled in their reliquaries at the lies. The counselors did not shout. They did not need to. They added a mark to a list, the kind that subtracts from a man's future. There was no riot. That comes later in other towns with other tolls. Here there was a smoothing, the city closing over its bruise, the way water closes when a stone sinks out of sight. The ordinance held. It did what such laws are designed to do. It taught people to look at one another with measuring eyes, to learn the narrow grammar of allowable shimmer, to speak rank in the language of cloth without moving their mouths. In Matthias's house, life tilted. The jar of oil stayed low all winter. The boys learned to warm their hands over breath before they warmed them at the brazier. He took more work of the poorer kind, coarse cloaks, unlined hoods, honest patches, and it kept them fed. At night, when he set down his new shears, he sometimes touched the old broken pair where they hung on a nail like a jaw made to remind him of speech. This far, no farther. Once he raised them and weighed them, feeling again the shock at the rivet, the iron's small cry. He could not say whether the weight he felt was shame or the first hard chip of pride. The woman with the rabbit trim came back in deeper cold. She stood in the doorway with snow on her shoulders, like life's dandruff, and asked without asking whether there might be a way to thicken a child's cloak without a clerk's eye guessing it. There are stitches that hide, threads dyed the color of mud and winter light. There is lining that does not gleam, but warms. There are pockets sewn into seams where a mother can tuck a scrap of wool felt, and no ribbon on any table can become curious about it. He did that work for her, and took his pay partly in onions shriveled sweet. The ordinance bred a craft of concealment. Dyers found duller shades that warmed the eye in their poverty. Wives patted their sleeves when they passed one another, a small ritual of comfort that looked like checking for dust. Girls learned to draw warmth not with fur but with close weave, to count the pick and the ends per inch the way their mothers once had counted coins. Guild oaths grew another sentence, spoken soft. We will not endanger the house for an inch of pride. And under it, the sentence no one spoke. We will not let the house starve for an inch of law. On Candlemas, St. Sibal's nave glowed with a forest of tapers, a warmth made of tallow and hope. Herr Kraft's wife came in lawful hem and lawful collar. People looked anyway, as they look at a hearth they cannot stand too near. The looking is always part of the heat. Matthias's wife stood in the aisle, hands cupped around a little flame, and sang words she had learned with the laundry and the market and the births. They had dressed their dignity in undyed wool. It was not beautiful, but it did not burn. Spring came with puddles that tasted of iron when the children splashed them onto their tongues. The city's ivy put out shoots that clung harder to the council wall. The clerks replaced the crimson ribbon. It had frayed at the tied places. New ordinances went up, this time about feast tables and the number of guests permitted to a journeyman's wedding dinner. Laughter met that edict at first, then silence, then compliance. You can teach a city to bend if you keep your hands steady and the bell loud. Years later, the black book still held Matthias's name in a line that had faded to a greenish brown. The boy who had flinched at the broken shears became a master who taught his apprentice to cut narrow and stitch close. And when the door was locked and the wind clawed under it like a cat, to put one extra layer where no eye would see. He taught him something else too, not with words but with his face when he watched sleeves inspected. That order tastes like iron if you chew it long enough, and that a man can keep the tongue of his trade even under a law's hard palate. As for Friedlein, whose hidden Wehr had been found by sound, he moved his shop to a lane near the ditch where fewer passed, and the smell drove away the curious. He worked in gray, and sold in gray, and died in gray, as if color itself had sentenced him. When you walk a city with stone in its bones, listen to what the walls remember. They tell that sumptuary laws did not only dress people, they arranged their gazes, taught neighbors to inventory neighbors, made a world where warmth could be a misdemeanor. They also tell of small resistances that left no marks in books. A cuff turned inward, a seam fattened by a single thread, the quick generosity of a leftover strip, shared and hidden. What price would you have paid for a day of lawful warmth? Would you have stitched your hunger down with obedience, or trimmed your conscience narrow and hidden a scrap by moonlight? Tell me softly, below. If this tale troubled your sleep, listen next to the market that fined the poor for washing at the fountain, or the village that labored 3 days a month for a lord's bridge they barely crossed.